Alright guys, welcome back, and in this lesson I wanted to go over these burp options right here, and also for each of these categories I want to give you guys a real brief overview of what they meant. So for example, if you don't know what a SOX proxy is, I'll give you guys a real quick general broad overview on it, and then you guys can be like, oh, that sounds pretty cool, that's something I want to look into and figure out how to use it with burp. So there you go. So under the Connections tab, Platform Authentication, we already know that authentication just means making sure someone is who they say they are. Now we can either do this with client authentication or server authentication, and burp supports a bunch of different types of authentication. There are a bunch of different rules on how you want to authenticate. Burp supports all of the most popular ones, and that is what you can set up right here. Now, upstream proxy and SOX proxy. We know what a proxy is, basically a middleman, like we said in, like the second tutorial. An upstream proxy, let's say that a company hired us to do some pen testing for their website. Now, the way they have it set up, we can't connect directly with our server, that company's target server. So, what we need to do instead is we need to go through a proxy. Now, a lot of companies do this to have an extra layer of security, so all traffic leaving or coming into their main server has to go through one of their proxies, and they do this, like I said, for security, or they can keep logs or whatever. But if you ever have to go through an additional upstream proxy to get to your target, then this is where you can configure those settings. A SOX proxy is a little bit different. So the proxies that we've been looking at so far, and especially in that, I don't know, like the tutorial however many videos ago, those are great when you're just doing stuff like browsing the internet, because those are just HTTP proxies. Now, you know that whenever you just start looking at sites, you always use the HTTP protocol. However, there are some proxies that allow you to use different protocols other than HTTP, and this is good if you ever want to do anything basically other than browse the internet. And also, SOX proxies, aside from allowing you to use different protocols, they're also a lot more secure and better at keeping your data private most of the time. So that is what a SOX proxy is, and if you ever want to use one, then there you go. These last couple, timeouts, hostname resolution, and out of scope requests, pretty simple. You know what a timeout is. How long do you want burp to wait for a response from the server before giving up? Obviously, if a server's not responding, you don't want to wait like 2 days, because that's just a waste of burp's resources. Hostname resolution, obviously, is how we're going to translate host names, in other words, www.google.com, to their IP address. If you ever want to override it from the default DNS server, then you can do it here. Out of scope requests, we already know what scope is. Pretty much the section of the internet that we want to work with. So what we can do are things like say, you know what, anytime you receive a request that's out of our target scope, then you can just drop it. But usually I like to say use sweet scope to find a target lab, because I like everything managed from that one scope without any additional settings anywhere else. Now in this HTTP tab, we have 3 different sections: redirections, streaming responses, and status 101 responses. Redirections, we saw this a little bit earlier whenever we logged in, is how do you want burp to behave whenever it gets redirected. For example, whenever we're on login page, and then we log in and it redirects us to my account page or my profile.php, whatever. So this is how you can deal with how do you want to handle redirections. Streaming responses are, let's say that you connect to a site and you try to watch a movie. Well, it's not just like a static web page or an image where the server gives it to you and then that's like, alright, I'm going to go do something else. Whenever you watch a movie, for example, that data is continuously streaming to us. So what do we want to do with streaming responses? Well, most of the time we don't want to keep all that data. Not even your browser keeps all the movie data whenever you're watching a YouTube video or whatever. So this is how you can handle streaming responses. Of course, you, like I said, don't want to usually keep them because they take up a lot of space. So there you go. and status 101 responses. If you don't know what a 100 response is, it means continue. So, for example, whenever you submit a form and then the server has to make another request to some other file before it sends you back the final response, then it has to do some intermediary other request. So it's going to send you just a continue, and it's basically its way of saying, hold on, got to go do something else real quick. And well, there you go. That's what 101 means. So it's not the final response. Now in the SSL tab, by the way, if you guys ever try using SSL with Java, you probably know that Java has a lot of trouble with it. And of course, Burp Suite was written in Java, so it sometimes has trouble with SSL. So anytime you want to manually, like adjust what algorithms you want to use, what protocols, what ciphers, then you can do so right here. But I'm going to warn you, you really don't want to mess with this area too often unless you really know what you're doing, because you really don't want to mess up the way Burp communicates and works with the rest of the internet, or every other tool is not going to work. Not a good thing. And some other things, you have client, server SSL certificates. Of course, you really can't manage server SSL certificates from here since this isn't plugged into your target server. But anytime you have a client SSL certificate, you can add, remove, do whatever you want. Server, these are just for viewing. So if you just want to view it, check it out. There you go. Now over in your sessions options, here is the problem that a lot of people have. Whenever they're trying to attack a website, they log in through Burp and then they might run some tool, do whatever. They find themselves getting booted off that website a lot. Now the reason for this is a bunch of websites, they write their sessions differently. I don't want to say they all, but a lot of websites use custom session handlers or do something really weird, and this is often due to security reasons for people like us who are trying to do weird things to it. So what you might have to do is you might have to have a custom session rule, and that's what these session rules mean. Basically, you need to tell Burp to do something when it makes a request. So anytime you need Burp to do something special, then you can just add a rule, and there you go. So this is just the name of it. The action is essentially saying, what exactly do you want me to do? And I don't know, maybe we need to check for a valid session ID before. There you go, a bunch of different things you can do. For scope, this is saying, what tools do you want to follow this rule? So maybe the intruder, whenever you're making a bunch of requests, that's when you have the problem. Everything else is fine. Maybe I don't know, like your spider, you only want your spider to follow it, and the rest of the tools just act as normal. So that's how you can set the scope. That's what that means. And of course, the URL scope. When do you want to have this rule come into effect? Do you want to use it all the time? Do you only want to use it when you're looking at web pages within your scope? So there you go. That's what a rule is. Now the cookie jar and macros. So your cookie jar, appropriately named, Burp is going to keep track of all the cookies, and by default, the tools, the spider and the proxy, whenever these tools run, that's the only cookies that it keeps track of. So for example, whenever your intruder is running and it comes across a new cookie, Burp doesn't care about that, and you usually want to leave this as spider and proxy are the only ones that we're going to monitor, because the cookies that you get in your intruder, they aren't usually that helpful. And of course, you can override this anytime if that's a vulnerability that you're looking for, but most of the time just leave these as default if you don't know what to do. And a macro is basically a tiny little computer program, and they're kind of similar to the rules. But let's say that, for example, you needed to have a new session ID every time you wanted to make a request. So what you could do is you could write a little macro, and again, what this does is every time you make a request, the macro would run, go get a new session ID, give it back to whatever tool you were using, and then you can use that session ID. So it's kind of like a little sub command. It's not an entirely new tool or plugin or anything like that. It's just something you want to run as, like I said, a sub command during your request. Now, display and miscellaneous, these are nothing I need to talk about. How do you want your font size? How do you want the look and feel? What kind of font do you want? That's all display stuff. Miscellaneous is if you want to add any hotkeys. What do you want to log? And this is your basic stuff right here. These four tabs were the only ones that would probably give you trouble. So there you go. Those are the burp options. And now you know.